There was a particular sigh that my mother made while looking out the kitchen window, and it was different from all her other sighs. The difference was subtle enough that I could not have described it to anyone. But as a child, I learned to recognize it, the way animals learn to recognize sounds that mean danger or safety. This sigh came on certain mornings, usually the ones when money had come in the mail, or when she was calculating whether the bills could be paid. It was not the sigh of exhaustion or frustration. It was something else, something that seemed to contain within it an entire calculus, an entire weight of considerations that had nothing to do with me, but that somehow affected everything about how the house felt. I remember the exact window she looked out of. It was the one above the sink, the one that faced the narrow alley between our building and the one next door. There was nothing particularly interesting to see out that window. A brick wall, the fire escape of the neighboring building, sometimes a cat moving through the alley. But my mother would stand there, her hands in the soapy water of the dishpan, or sometimes just resting on the counter, and she would look out that window with an expression that seemed to be looking through the window rather than at it. She wore the same coat every day during the winter months. It was a brown coat, well made but not new, not fashionable, and it had been worn smooth in certain places by years of use. The button at the top was always slightly loose, and I would sometimes watch her check it before going out, making sure it would not come off completely. The coat had pockets that were deep, and she would keep her hands in those pockets when she walked, moving through the neighborhood with a kind of efficiency that suggested she knew exactly where she was going and why. I did not think of these things as notable at the time. They were simply the facts of my mother's existence, the normal details of how she moved through the world. But as I became older, I began to understand that I was reading something in these details, that my child's mind was making calculations about what the details meant, what they suggested about my mother's interior landscape, what they told me about the reality of her life. The calendar on the kitchen wall had dates marked in pen. Some of these marks were benign, appointments, birthdays, the dates when rent was due. But there were other marks that seemed to carry a different kind of weight. The first of the month was always marked. The days when my mother's paychecks came. She worked part-time doing cleaning work for families in a wealthier part of the city. Those days were marked with a small circle. As I got older and learned to tell time and to understand the calendar, I began to realize that these marks represented the skeleton of survival, the organized plan that kept everything from collapsing. My mother did not talk about money with me, not explicitly, not in any way that required me to worry about it. But I was not deaf to the conversations that happened between her and other adults, the fragments I would overhear as I pretended to read or do homework in another room. Conversations about rent, about the heating bill, about whether it was going to be a tight month. Conversations conducted in lowered voices that seemed to assume I could not hear, but that a child learns to listen for carefully, understanding that the information being conveyed was important. There was a particular phone call that my mother made sometimes late in the evening when she thought I was asleep. I would hear her voice from the kitchen, speaking in the particular cadence that meant she was talking to her sister who lived far away in a different city. The conversations were not long, and they seemed to follow a pattern. My mother would ask questions about people I mostly did not know, would give updates about things that had happened, and then there would be a period of silence during which she was listening to her sister, her face showing whatever emotion was being conveyed across the telephone line. I understood, without being explicitly told, that these conversations were a kind of lifeline for my mother, that they connected her to a part of her own life that existed separately from the role she played as my parent, as the person responsible for making sure that food appeared on the table and that bills were paid. I understood that my mother had a sister who mattered to her, that they thought about each other, that they maintained a connection across the distance that separated them. And I understood, though I could not have put this into words, that my mother sometimes needed to talk to her sister, needed to be reminded that there was a world beyond the narrow streets of our neighborhood, beyond the confines of the apartment where we lived, beyond the daily struggle of making sure that everything held together. The cabinet where my mother kept the money was in the bedroom, on a high shelf that I could not reach. I knew it was there because I had seen her reach for it, had seen her count out bills with careful attention, had seen her put money back with the kind of relief that suggested the counting had come out differently than she had feared. I did not look in that cabinet when I had the opportunity, even though the opportunity certainly arose. It seemed like a private thing, something that was not meant for me to see. The knowing that the cabinet existed, the understanding that money was kept there and was carefully managed, seemed to be information that I was meant to have without having to look at the details. There was a particular quality to my mother's attention when she was reading her mail. The electric bill, the telephone bill, the notices from the landlord, the occasional letter from her sister. She would open these things carefully, would read them thoroughly, would set them aside in designated piles. Some of the piles meant bills that had to be paid immediately. Other piles meant things that could wait, or things that could be handled by putting aside a small amount each month. This was a kind of literacy that had nothing to do with formal education. This was the literacy of survival, of understanding what had to be done and in what order. I began to notice, as I got older, the ways that my mother made choices that were not always the obvious choices. She would buy the cheaper brand of something even when it seemed like it would be less good, but then she would buy a more expensive brand of something else. And I understood that she was making calculations based on factors that I did not fully comprehend. She was understanding value in a way that went beyond simple price. She was understanding quality and necessity and what was worth spending money on and what was not. The shoes she wore every day were sensible shoes, shoes meant for work, shoes that could withstand the wear of walking through the city on the various jobs she took to make money. She had other shoes, nicer shoes that she wore on Sundays when we went to church. But the shoes she wore every day were practical and worn. The heels were scuffed, the leather was creased from use, but the shoes were kept clean, were polished regularly, were maintained with care. This was not vanity. This was respect for the objects that served her, that enabled her to do the work that needed to be done. I think I began to understand, somewhere around the age of 10 or 11, that my mother was not simply the person who took care of me. She was also a person who was taking care of herself, who was managing her own life, who was making choices and carrying burdens and dealing with things that were not my responsibility to know about. This realization came not as a shock, but as a gradual shifting of perception, an understanding that deepened slowly over time through the accumulated evidence of small observations. There was a particular look that would cross my mother's face when I asked for something. Not anger, not impatience, but something more complicated. It was the look of someone calculating whether this thing could be afforded, whether it could be worked into the budget, whether it was a need or a want. And sometimes, even when I could sense that the money was tight, she would say yes, and I understood that she was making a decision to deprioritize something else, to shift things around so that I could have what I had asked for. This was love expressed not in words or in physical affection, but in calculation and sacrifice. This was love expressed through the careful management of limited resources. This was love expressed through the decision to bear a burden so that the person you were caring for would not have to bear it. I did not think of it as love at the time. I simply thought of it as the way things were, the way that my mother moved through the world. But I was absorbing an education in what love could mean, what it looked like when it was not performed but lived, when it was quiet and steady and required sacrifice. There was something else that I began to notice as well, something about my mother's body, about the way that she seemed to be tired in a way that was not just the tiredness of having worked hard. There was a kind of weariness that seemed to live in her bones, that seemed to be the accumulated fatigue of years of managing, of calculating, of carrying. She would sit down sometimes, and it would be as if the sitting was a relief, as if her body had been storing up the need to rest and was finally able to acknowledge it. I noticed when she had a headache, which seemed to happen with some regularity, particularly on days when there had been phone calls about money or when something unexpected had happened that had thrown off her carefully laid plans. She would go into the bedroom and lie down with a cool cloth over her eyes and the house would become quieter, would adjust itself to accommodate her need for rest. We would be quieter. We would demand less. We understood, without being told, that something had gone out of my mother temporarily and that she needed time to restore it. But she always came back. The headaches would pass. She would return to the kitchen or to whatever she needed to do next. She would resume her work without complaint, without explanation, without asking for sympathy or acknowledgement. She simply returned to the work of maintaining, of managing, of making sure that everything continued to function. As I moved into my teenage years, I realized that I was learning a kind of reading that was particular to observing people you lived with, people you knew intimately, people whose interior lives were not explicitly discussed, but were nevertheless evident in the details of how they moved through the world. I was learning to understand that what was not said was often as important as what was said, that the silences carried information, that the details mattered. I began to understand that my mother had dreams and hopes that extended beyond the immediate struggle of making ends meet. I began to understand that the phone calls to her sister were more than just updates about family news. They were a way of maintaining connection to a version of herself that existed before she was my mother, before she was the person whose primary job was to make sure that her child was cared for. There was a night when I came into the kitchen late and found my mother sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, looking at something that looked like a magazine or a pamphlet. I could not quite see what it was, and she folded it quickly when she realized I was there, putting it away in a drawer. But in that moment, I understood that there were parts of her interior life, parts of her thinking and her imagining that were not meant to be shared with me, that were private in the way that all people deserve to have parts of their lives be private. And I understood in that moment something about respect. I understood that respecting the people you lived with meant accepting that they had interior lives that you did not have complete access to, that there were things they thought about and wanted and dreamed about that were not your business to know, that the privacy of another person's thoughts was something to be honored. Looking back now, I see that my mother was doing so much more than simply keeping us alive and cared for, though that was certainly part of it. She was teaching me, through her example, something about what it meant to survive with dignity, what it meant to face difficult circumstances without being destroyed by them, what it meant to find small pockets of hope or rest or beauty in the midst of a life that was largely structured around necessity. She was teaching me, through her hands and through her choices and through the calculated decisions she made every day, something about self-respect and self-determination. She was teaching me that a person could live under constraint and still maintain their own sense of dignity, still make choices that reflected their values, still preserve a core of self that belonged only to them. The calendar on the wall, the marks in pen, the careful budget, the practical shoes, the brown coat, the sigh at the kitchen window, these things were not separate from who my mother was. They were evidence of who she was, proof of her commitment to survival, testament to the intelligence and skill that she brought to the work of managing a life under difficult circumstances. And the things that were not said, the phone calls to her sister, the private moments, the interior life that I was not meant to fully access. These things were equally important. These things were evidence of a person who was more than the role she played in my life, a person with her own hopes and connections and dreams. What I learned, without being explicitly taught, was that survival and dignity are not separate things, that the daily work of managing limited resources can be done with care and intention, that love is most often expressed through actions rather than words, that people are infinitely more complex than they appear on the surface. I learned this not through instruction, but through observation, through paying attention to the details of how someone moved through the world, through understanding that the quiet things, the unspoken things, the carefully managed details often carry the most important information about what matters and why.